Welcome. Tēnā koutou katoa to everybody. Welcome to our third of our Leading for Wellbeing webinar series from Kahui Oranga. This is the third of three, and we're looking at feeling safe at work and psychological safety. I'm Lisa Ducat from the Mental Health Foundation. I'm the Workplace Wellbeing Specialist. At the Foundation, we're in collaboration with the other groups across the health sector for this work. We always start and finish with karakia for our workshops to create a space where we set the intention for the time and then close. So I'm just going to begin with karakia. Unuhia te pō whirimarama, tumokia te au whatu tangata, te tai ki runga, te tai ki raro, te tai ahoro. Haumi e, hui e, taiaki e. And for the translation of that, it's from the confusion comes understanding, from the understanding comes unity. We are interwoven, we are interconnected together as one. Felt like that was an appropriate opening for this topic, but also for this group of workers. We work in healthcare, we work as a united team, whether we're in admin, whether we're clinical, whether we're porters or we're helpers, we're all aiming for the same thing. So thank you very much. As I said, I'm Lisa from the Mental Health Foundation. The aim of this kōrero and the other webinars we've done is around supporting the leaders across our healthcare sector with giving them food for thought and offering some practical ideas and ways of working to strengthen confidence and ability so that they can lead for ha'ora. I'm joined, and I'm really honoured to be joined by the lovely three people you can see on the screen, starting with Alexis Cameron, who is a physiotherapist by profession. Alexis currently works as an organisational development practice lead at Auckland DHB. Ruth Robertson joins me. She's an organisational psychology specialist, currently working in Canterbury and West Coast DHB. And Jo Egan, thank you for joining, a senior emergency medicine doctor and clinical lead of people and culture within Waitemata DHB. So a real range of perspectives and knowledge, and I welcome you all today. So we're going to be exploring the role we all have as leaders in supporting people to feel safe at work today. How can we support our people to be themselves, talk honestly about how they are, how the job's going, and what they need to succeed. The last two webinars we focused on the importance of looking after ourselves and also understanding that we all don't experience the world in the same way. Today, we're looking at ways of working that create safe, healthy, sustainable teams. And we know over the last year, we've all had to take on new roles. Our roles have changed. We've had to work differently. Some of us have had to step back. Some of us have had to step up, and we've all had to learn as we go. To keep this up, we know that we have to have a space, not just to talk about the work, but how we're feeling. So how do we create an environment where we can talk about our fears, show vulnerability, and build team strength and a stronger bond, where we can be honest with each other and ensure both physical and psychological safety? So what is safety at work? I'd like to invite the panel to share their perspectives on psychological safety at work. So my first question to you all is, how do you view psychological safety at work? What's the lens or the perspective you bring? And what would you like those watching today to understand? I'm just going to throw in there that if the audience would like to ask any questions, to put them into the Q&A, and we'll come to those at the end. We've got sort of three core questions. So can I start with you, Jo? What's your perspective and the lens, and what are the things you want people to take away today?
Thanks, Lisa, and kia ora, everyone. So I think that when I first started thinking about psychological safety, it was in a clinical education space. And in fact, it wasn't even called psychological safety, but from an education point of view, we do purposely think about creating a safe climate or a safe environment for learners and participants to be able to feel safe enough so that they can learn deeply, meaning that they're safe enough to unpack underlying assumptions, unconscious assumptions that may be influencing the way that they were thinking or what was there, so that they can add on it and learn from that, and then translate into a clinical space or into whatever space they need to take that into. That they feel safe to take risks, that they know somebody's going to have their back, that they're not going to be judged, that leap to take risks, that courage is there within that safety that we help to create. And also that they're safe to be authentic, that they're safe to bring their authentic selves, to look at what are their strengths and skills, and how can that add to the whole. So they would really be my three things. And then I think the next step really from there was, this is such a great concept in education. What would this look like if we took this into our workspaces? What if we tried to purposefully create safe workspaces? What would that mean in terms of our abilities to take risks, to work really well, to build relationships with each other, and to look after our patients, whether we're right there at the patients or whether we're further along in the chain that's looking after our patients? How can we do that really well?
Thanks, Jo. Actually, if it's all right, I'm going to follow up with Ruth, because I know that's an area, actually, how do you do that in work, not just an educational setting that you're currently on. Is it all right if you follow up with your perspective now?
Yeah, absolutely. Kia ora koutou. So I wear the lens, I guess, as an organisational psychology specialist, of working in the culture space and looking at how we can transform our organisations into even healthier workplaces. And we know that psychological safety is a core tenet of that. So how does that show up in any team? I guess for me, an example of psychological safety existing in a team is that people feel comfortable in, say, a meeting context to talk about things that they don't know or that they don't understand, to admit that, that they're curious or that they want to explore something, that they tend to feel that they don't have to put on an air of knowing it all or an air of perfection, if you like. So it's okay to not know. And I think as well, an example of psychological safety sort of showing up and manifesting in a team context, as well as that teams feel comfortable raising hard things too, to talk about more difficult issues, I suppose. They could be concerns, or they could be reservations about specific pieces of work, about how things are done around here, maybe how the team's showing up, how well they're working together. Or it could be about, examining behaviours, because we know that if there's unproductive or harmful behaviour in an organisational setting, particularly healthcare, it can have very harmful impacts on patient outcomes and patient experiences. So it's critical that we feel safe to surface that stuff. I also think there's one other thing that comes up for me here, is that when we make a mistake, and I think Jo alluded to this with the medical education context, when we experience mistakes or near misses or failures or a critical incident of some kind, people feel okay to examine it and explore it safely, and that they don't feel they'll be blamed or victimised or belittled or undermined in any way. And they see it as an opportunity for growth and insight and learning. Yeah, so there could be some examples of how I see it showing up.
Thank you, Ruth. Alexis, you're working in the ADHB, and I'm really keen to hear about your lens, because it's such a diverse, you work across the whole hospital. It's a very diverse workforce, and it's a very diverse roles that are played. So where's your perspective come from for psychological safety, and what would you like people to take away?
Oh yeah, thank you, Lisa. Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi noi kia koutou. He iritia no ngā te parau te whānau apanoi me Ngāpuhi, Aotearoa mai Alafua apia i Samoa. And in the spirit of Tongan Language Week, malo elele, ko hoku ingoa ko Alexis. And so thank you everybody. As wahine Māori and wahine Pasifika, what enables what psychological safety means to me is equity work. And dismantling institutional racism work. And what I mean by that is, with the wicked problem that is institutional racism, it requires courageous conversation. It requires us to really have robust talanoa. And what I mean by talanoa is, tala to speak, no about nothing in particular or nothing of significance, but it is underpinned by love, warmth, respect, and humour. And so for us to really dismantle institutional racism and eliminate healthcare inequities requires us to be courageous. But in order for us to be courageous, we need psychological safety to contribute into those spaces. Yeah. And also just mana enhancing too, like I really wanted to put that in, hasn't flowed this time around, but you know, when we're engaging and contributing to a space, how are we acknowledging, protecting, enhancing the mana of those who we're speaking with? Yeah, especially when, you know, Ruth alluded to surfacing issues, was it like, yeah, bringing, like talking about the hard things and
racism's definitely a hard thing.
It is, and you know, speaking against the status quo requires psychological safety.
Yeah, no, and thank you very much. It's actually, you've all come through with something which the theme I'm getting is, it's got to be intentional. You actually have to have a purpose for it, to increase people's honesty learning, to allow them to bring their whole selves, for them to actually be able to speak about the hard things as well as the other things. So it's got to be an intentional way of working to create this safety. So just to make a terrible pun, creating a safe work environment for both physical and psychological health isn't something that happens by accident. You know, you've got to actually do active things to enable that safety. Can I get you guys to share what you think's really important for enabling people to feel that safety and enable that psychological safety at work? Can I start with Ruth this time?
Yeah, I think there's some really simple actions that teams can take to start building greater levels of psychological safety and to create a climate of safety in their environment. So an example might be just about creating, I guess, normalizing giving and receiving feedback. And okay to give and receive feedback, and developing some skill and aptitude in that space as well. And that's not just about the critical feedback, it's also about acknowledgement, because we know that there's really strong research that organisations that have more of an appreciative culture and lens on their people tend to outperform organisations that are more focused on deficits and weaknesses. So there's a real opportunity to dial that up. As well, there's something about celebrating, I guess, the diversity of talents and skills, and validating and valuing those, and also utilising them to their fullest capacity. You know, are people in the team feeling encouraged to contribute in any way that they feel they can, or do they feel constrained or constricted in some shape or form? So how can we access those strengths and talents and harness them a lot more overtly, I suppose? Yeah, those would be two examples I think that spring to mind about what we can do to sort of facilitate that in our environments.
Yeah, and it's a wonderful thing to start asking and telling people you did that well, but also, you know, and it's a nice way to start the conversation. Alexis, is it all right if I ask you to follow up with what you think enables safety at work?
Yeah, so what enables psychological safety for me, I guess, is cultural safety, is people possessing cultural safety. If we just acknowledge and I guess appreciate that our default settings, we're hardwired to really like and take a liking to things that are familiar and similar, and not like things that are different. For me, being steeped in Te Ao Māori and Te Ao Pasifika, I present difference every time I open my mouth, you know, and so what enables psychological safety for me is people having cultural safety and having that critical self-reflection within themselves to recognise, appreciate and value diversity of thought.
That's a really slightly, I suppose for me, confronting, coming from Pākehā background, to walk into a room. I don't confront difference the same way. I don't create that. And so thank you very much for sharing that, because it is something actually I need to pay attention to, that actually you're overcoming my inherent want for sameness, and I need to relax a little bit more about that. Jo, what would you like to add about enabling?
Yeah, I think to build on everything else that has been said, that's been great. I think it also to remember that actually this is about every interaction we have. This is about relationships. And we know, inherently, we know how to do this. We do it with our families. We do it with our friends. And so it's just a matter of bringing that knowledge in terms of relationship building back into the workspace. And within, we talked a little bit about that being an overt thing in a clinical education setting. So we overtly talk about how to set that up, that being overtly kind to one another, that helps to build that safety, to have overt mutual respect, and not only to be open to other perspectives, but to invite them, to purposely invite them. And actually, as faculty or as leaders, if we model that behavior in being aware of the language that we use in every conversation that we have, in being aware of the behavior that we are portraying and that we're living out in every interaction that we have, and purposely going and inviting voices from all sorts of different perspectives.
Thank you. I'm just hearing there's some thoughts that come up from this conversation, that being overt about it, being deliberate, being aware of the difference, and that actually we do like to surround ourselves with similar things, and bringing up, of course, actually pointing out the strengths that the teams have and individuals have, because we all want to do a good job. So I'm wondering if we can explore that a little bit more, and what sort of actions leaders can actually take to intentionally, overtly do this. I am reminded in an earlier conversation, a really good example you gave, Alexis, earlier off the webinar, about the difference in some teams, that we have these two sayings: the squeaky wheel gets the oil, the loudest duck gets shot. So, which I thought really demonstrates, you know, that there are different ways of communicating too, and culturally, but also just in our learning, we all learn different ways of actually being heard. So I'm wondering, how do you, as leaders, how can you suggest to leaders to start the conversation towards creating that safety and inclusion for every person in the team? I'm supposed to lead and say who jumps in here. I'm wondering, Ruth, is it all right if I start with you?
Oh, of course, of course. I think there is so much power that leaders have to start creating psychologically safe climates, not just within the teams that they directly influence, but the teams all around them. As Jo's point earlier made, you know, this is about every interaction, every opportunity that we have to connect and relate to one another in the workplace. I think for me, one of the core underpinnings of psychological safety is vulnerability, and vulnerability-based trust, I suppose. So I see leaders having a really strong role to play in role modelling that vulnerability, and actually being more overt and explicit about letting people know that they would like some help or assistance, perhaps, that they maybe don't have all the answers, or that they're even struggling, and that they would like to reach out and connect with others, sort of complement some of those gaps or those needs that they might have. It then, you know, implicitly makes it okay for others to do the same. When people witness their leaders around them demonstrating that level of vulnerability, we all have permission to do it too. I think also, to the points made earlier, there's an opportunity that leaders have in the climates in which they lead and influence to actually celebrate difference, to actually make it fundamentally okay to have a different lens on matters, to have a different view on discussions or ways of working, and actually allowing a conversation that celebrates those differences to be normalised and to be seen as a healthy discourse and not something that people fear or shy away from. So I think those are quite sort of tangible actions that leaders can take that aren't necessarily radical or hard. There's simple tweaks and adaptations that they can build into the normal cadence of how they work.
And just that's actually really hit me, is that vulnerability is often we feel asking for help is somehow failing, but actually we know we all need help, and actually a team creates success. So if you're not hearing those great insights from the rest of your team, you're not actually necessarily able to do the best. So yeah, that was actually really powerful for me, Ruth. Alexis, you talked earlier about some of the things that are important from your perspective, the talanoa and mana enhancing approaches, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that kind of approach to the building of relationships and creating safety. We spoke earlier about whakawhanaungatanga as being a really important part of it, and I'd really like to hear more about how a leader maybe can start to do that.
Yeah, no, thank you. And so that's it, in terms of what can leaders do, I'm like, connect with your team, like authentically and genuinely connect. And what I mean by that is really get to know people. When we say whakawhanaungatanga, because in a Pākehā Western context, an introduction typically goes your name, your vocation, what are you here to do? Particularly within a clinical centre, being a physiotherapist, hi, I'm your physio, this is what I'm here to do you consent? In a Māori Pacific context, it's who are you? Who is your family? Where do you come from? What landmark, and so we really do start with, this is where I'm from, and we frame our identity not by our vocation. And so in terms of enabling psychological safety and for people to bring their whole selves and really their whole worldview, because in situations where when I haven't felt psychologically safe, there's a lot of mental gymnastics that go from here to here in terms of really trying to position things, but if I don't have to do that, that's fantastic for me. So yeah, and so it's really just enabling the space. Another thing in Pacific, and I don't mean to smush Māori and Pacific concepts together, because it is unhelpful. We are two distinctly different groups. I guess I'm both, and so that's my life. But in terms of the VAR, so the VAR being the interrelational space between people, and so we think we are conscious about how we're nurturing the VAR. So how are we nurturing the interrelational space between people? And we do that through talanoa, just robust talanoa, get to know you. And also just, I love, the whole squeaky wheel gets the oil, loudest duck gets shot. Those are people who are in our teams. And so how do we know where people are sitting on that spectrum? By getting to know them.
Yeah. That's actually really interesting, because it's a lot of the more just focus as a leader in a work situation is, how do I go, you did a good job? But this is wider than this, isn't it? It's actually about that whole person, authentic person, which reflects back on our last webinar, where it actually was also about, hey, what's going on for you? Being able to go, actually, things are, a bit tough at the moment, I'm under extra stress, ask for help, but also that builds that trust for the ongoing conversation. I wanted to bring up the conversation we had off webinar about talanoa. You said that it needed love, respect, humour, and I've forgotten the fourth one, Alexis.
Warmth. So love, warmth, respect, and humour.
Yeah.
So according to what it can be viewed.
Yeah. So that idea too of actually having those elements intentionally in every conversation is the other thing that I've heard. But I wonder also, we've got a little bit of time, and there are no, I was going through thinking if there were any questions where we'd make sure we had time, but I actually would like to really explore that that idea of, as a leader, how when things are difficult, because we're going to have teams who are quite stressed. That's natural. We're working in an area where there's risk, and we've talked about making it safe to take risks. What helps? One, we've already said having that relationship to begin with helps with actually dealing with the difficult stuff. But what are some of the ways that maybe you guys have experienced? And Jo, if it's okay, I'm going to spring this question on you. Is some advice for people who have, when the going gets tough, ways that you've made it safe for people to go, I need help, or I made a mistake?
Thank you, Lisa. So I think that there's one simple fundamental that I try and bring myself back to, and that is that if I if I start with an assumption that every person is coming to work to do their best job, and what they did at that time, that the decisions that they made at that time, that was the best decision that they could make under that, in that context, with the information that they had available or were able to retrieve from their mind or their team at that time, and that seemed like an appropriate thing to do for them at that time. And I think that with that underlying assumption and that underlying a belief that seemed like the right thing to do at the time, it then enables me to be genuinely curious rather than judgmental. That was an interesting thing to do. I may not have done that, but tell me what was going through your mind. And in that genuine curiosity, you're creating that space for them to say, oh yeah, actually it didn't necessarily work that well, but this is what I was thinking and this is why I did it. And so there's respect and safety and an ability to look and learn from whatever that difficulty was. And I think that's what I try and keep reminding myself to do, to come back to that assumption that we are all here doing our best. And then curiously and compassionately inquiring, how can I help you if it doesn't look so great?
I thought that was a lovely, a very practical thing, actually, starting with yourself and going, what is my assumptions here? And then being curious and going, well, what are other people's assumptions? We've just got 2 or 3 minutes to go, and I need to do the public announcement things to remind people that this is a series of webinars that you can get at Wellbeing for Health, and there's going to be resources, because one of the things is we want people to start this conversation. This is an ongoing journey about leadership, about compassionate leadership, and actually learning how to look after yourself and look after your team for a constantly changing environment. There's going to be resources linked to this this webinar around tools to help you have these conversations. There's one about connecting in with your team and doing a wellbeing check-in, but there's also going to be other resources around actually having these sorts of conversations. I want to thank the panel. I think everybody's insights have been really helpful, and I've very much enjoyed it. I always get more to think about. Is there any closing comments anybody would like to make before I close with karakia?
No, other than, you know, I just talk everything we've seen, and thank you so much for having us today. And, you know, my passion does lie around equity and institutional racism. And I know that by enabling psychological safety really allows us to have those conversations that are just needed to raise the critical consciousness that needs to happen in our system. Thank you.
I think if we go with that intention that Jo talked about and go with that mana enhancing willingness, and what Ruth talked about, being open to vulnerability, yes, then we can maybe hear about what's not working for everybody and embrace that difference, because actually that brings strength to teams. So thank you all so much. I had a little summary to say. Basically, we need to have great conversations to build respect and trust, and that means when we get prickly stuff that comes up, we're going to feel safe to say what's needed. I'm going to close with karakia. And thank you all for joining us. We can't see you. I hope it's been helpful and useful for those listening. Kia whakairia te tapu, kia waitia ai tiara, kia turiki whakataha ai, kia turiki whakataha ai, homi e, hui e, taiaki e.
Thank you.
And for those, just to know, this says restrictions are moved aside so the pathway is clear to return to everyday activities. Thank you very much.
Kia ora.
Thank you, everybody.
Kia ora.
Ngā mihi.